Before we begin, I just have one quick programming note for today. There are a lot of Spanish, German, Italian, and French words in today's podcast. I've lived my whole life in places like Kermit, Levelland, Lubbock. So just want to let you know I've tried my best to figure out how to pronounce these words, and I'm sure I've failed, but I just want you to know that I did try. Thanks for listening, and here comes the podcast. Hey y'all, I'm Jody Slaughter, and welcome to West Texas, where the sky stretches on forever and the stories are as vast and rugged as the landscape itself. On this program, we will explore the characters who have etched their names into the sun-bleached history of this region, from outlaws and lawmen to everyday folks who dared to dance with destiny. We'll explore the legends, the truths, and the tall tales that define this undefinable region. Today, we're diving into a story of grit, innovation, and transformation. A tale that stretches from El Paso to Lubbock to France, and from the time of the conquistador to today. How Texas, once seen as an unlikely contender in the world of wine, has risen to become a major player on the global stage. So pour yourself a glass of your favorite Texas wine. It was probably grown in West Texas, whether it says so or not. Kick off your boots and join me as we uncork the fascinating story of Texas viticulture, from its humble origins to its award-winning place today on the global stage. Wine has been a part of West Texas for 350 years. A legacy that began long before it became a modern agricultural powerhouse. This enduring tradition traces back to the earliest Spanish explorers who, driven by both faith and fortune, introduced vino to the arid landscapes of Texas. Even though grapes have grown wild in Texas for thousands of years, there's no record of Native American tribes producing anything like wine. So it wasn't until the Spanish arrived in the 1600s that wine made its first appearance. As Spanish explorers ventured into the New World, they were fueled by dreams of gold and silver, akin to the treasures of the Aztec Empire. Yet as they pushed through the unforgiving terrains of New Mexico and Texas, they found little of these riches, leading many to abandon the region, except for the Catholic Church, whose missionaries saw a spiritual wealth in the souls they sought to convert. The problem was, without gold and silver to send back to fill the Spanish coffers, they would be on their own, with little to no assistance from the Spanish government or military. In 1659, Franciscan missionaries led by Fray Garcia de San Francisco established Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission at a site called El Paso del Norte, situated at a vital pass between mountain ranges along the Rio Grande. This mission would become the cradle of Texas winemaking. It still stands today on the Juarez side of the river, the oldest structure in the El Paso area. Now, wine was an absolute necessity for these Spanish missionaries. How else would they provide the Holy Eucharist to their converts? But shipping wine on a months-long transatlantic journey from Spain just wasn't feasible. So Fray Garcia planted a vineyard at the mission. By 1662, it takes 2 to 3 years for vines to produce fruit. The vineyard was established and the first West Texas wine was produced. Just ignore the fact that it was a few yards on the wrong side of the river. There's some controversy about what grape varietal Garcia planted, but accounts at the time reported that it was the Lenoir grape, also referred to as Spanish Black sometimes, or the Mission grape. Now, this mission was largely a backwater, with the real Spanish activity happening in modern-day New Mexico, centered around the colonial capital of Santa Fe. That would change with the Pueblo Uprising of 1680, when the Pueblo tribe of New Mexico, suffering from Spanish diseases, drought, and Apache raids, attacked Santa Fe, killing 400 settlers and missionaries. The provincial governor ordered a retreat, and 3,000 Spaniards fled down the Rio Grande to the safety of El Paso and the Garcia missions there. It would be 12 years before the Spanish would recapture Santa Fe, and having such a population influx in El Paso would necessitate large-scale expansion of agriculture efforts, including grape production. But once the situation stabilized for Spain, El Paso's location along the Camino Real from Santa Fe to the Spanish capital in Mexico City meant that a constant flow of travelers would sample the pass wine, as they called it, and its notoriety would spread throughout New Spain. The El Paso vineyards would flourish for over 200 years until flooding wiped most of them out in the late 1800s. Now let's fast forward a couple centuries from Fray Garcia's mission vines. Not much has happened in Texas, just a Mexican Revolution, a Texan Revolution, joining the U.S., leaving the U.S., and joining the U.S. again. And during this time, the population demographics drastically changed. Native American tribes rose and fell. The Comanche arrived and conquered most of West Texas before being conquered themselves. The few Europeans who lived here during Fray Garcia's time were Spanish missionaries and government bureaucrats. Now there were immigrants, and lots of them. Germans, French, Italians, and Americans, many from countries where wine was an ingrained part of everyday life. And of course, they brought that culture with them. In the 1840s, a German named Einwanderer formed a society to promote German colonization in the Republic of Texas. His society, the Adelsverein, purchased a land grant, the Fisher-Miller Grant, for almost 4 million acres in west central Texas. Now, to get an idea of the size of this, it extended basically from modern-day San Angelo in the northwest to Marble Falls in the southeast, and then from Goldthwaite in the northeast past Junction in the southwest. It was just a massive area that encompasses 7 modern-day counties. It was also, unbeknownst to the Germans, the heart of Comancheria. So the Germans began arriving by ship at the Texas coast by the thousands in 1844 and made their way inland towards the land grant. But poor timing meant that they weren't going to make it to the grant and get settlements built before winter hit, a fact relayed to the Germans by legendary Texas Ranger John Coffee Hayes. So the Adelsverein set up way stations along the route for the settlers to winter before resuming their journey to the Promised Land in the spring. But due to financial mismanagement by the Adelsverein and upon learning of the existence of the Comanche, most of the immigrants decided that these way stations suited them perfectly fine. We're good. No need to go any further west. We're going to stay right here. The names of these temporary stopping points: New Braunfels and Fredericksburg. Now that the German immigrants had a permanent home, they began to farm the surrounding areas. Some of the settlers had brought grapevine cuttings with them, and vineyards were planted. But there was a problem, one that plagues Texas grape growers to this day. Vitis vinifera is the term used to encompass all European grape varietals. And Vitis vinifera doesn't grow well in most of Texas. The vines don't tolerate our late freezes and dust storms well, and these natural calamities have historically led to the complete loss of grape production every 7 years on average. Funguses like root rot and black rot devastated crops before fungicides became prevalent. And Pierce's disease, a bacteria spread by insects, is still a problem today. Finally, there's phylloxera, an aphid that feeds on roots, eventually killing the whole vine. So when the German settlers of the Adelsverein began planting vineyards in central Texas, they faced the harsh reality of their new environment. Unlike the climates of their homeland, Texas proved unforgiving. While we know that Germans planted vineyards, there's no record that any of them came to successful harvest and wine production. The emotional toll was immense. Each failed harvest represented not just a financial loss, but a blow to the settlers' hopes of establishing a thriving community. I mean, these wines were integral to how they lived. Their frustration grew as they watched their dreams of a flourishing wine industry wither year after year after year. After multiple failures with the European varietals, the German settlers turned to the native Mustang grape, a hardy vine that could withstand the Texas climate. Though Mustang grapes had a lower sugar content, making the wine a lot less palatable by European standards. So the settlers adapted by experimenting with sugar and other techniques to make the wine drinkable. This resilience allowed the German communities to continue producing wine, albeit of a different character than they were accustomed to up until the era of Prohibition. Following the Civil War, a new wave of Italian immigrants arrived in Texas, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. They too brought a rich tradition of winemaking, rooted in generations of family vineyards back in Italy. In 1900, there were 4,000 Italians living in Texas, concentrated in several ethnic communities around the state. One of the most impactful of these immigrants was Frank Quaglia, a farmer from Milan who was recruited in the 1870s by Mexico to help build an agricultural community. Upon arriving, though, he learned that Mexico wasn't going to hold up its end of the bargain, and Quaglia ended up in modern-day Del Rio area in 1881. There he found cheap land, plentiful water from the Rio Grande, and Lenoir grapevines, likely sourced from the many Spanish missions up and down the Rio Grande that had taken up production after Fray Garcia's success. In addition to farming other produce for sale in San Antonio, Quaglia planted a small vineyard of the Lenoir grapes and petitioned the state of Texas for a winery permit, founding the Valverde Winery, permit number 17 issued by the state. In 1900, he produced 200 barrels of wine. As the wine industry slowly grew, so too did the tension between traditional winemaking practices and the increasingly strict regulations being proposed by state and federal authorities. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of temperance movements across the United States, which began to view alcohol, including wine, as a social ill. This growing push for regulation, coupled with the pressures of industrialization and urbanization, set the stage for the most dramatic change yet: prohibition. The seeds of conflict between cultural traditions and emerging laws were being sown, foreshadowing a battle that would soon reshape the Texas wine industry. In 1919, Prohibition would close almost all of the vineyards and wineries in the state, but Valverde managed to stay in operation, producing grape jelly, sacramental wine for the Catholic Church. This was exempted from Prohibition, and they sold grapes to do-it-yourself winemakers to make illicitly at home. After the fall of Prohibition, Valverde would be relicensed by the state in 1935 and would continue producing wine through successive generations of Quaglias. Today, Valverde is the longest operating bonded winery in the state, and in 2008, they received a Land Heritage Award from the Department of Agriculture for 125 years of continuous operation. Hey, West Texas. I want to tell you quickly about Code Ninjas, where your kids can grow their STEM skills while unearthing newfound confidence and critical thinking abilities. With year-round programs for kids 5 and up, Code Ninjas will teach your kids how to build their own video games, all in a fun and safe environment. With West Texas locations in Lubbock, Midland, and El Paso, plus all over the country, visit codeninjas.com today and claim your free trial class where your kid will build their first video game. Plus, with back to school in full swing, mention that you heard about it on the WTX podcast to get their first month for just $50. That offer is at the Lubbock location only. Code Ninjas, creating a world where kids write the code. The year was 1862, and the French countryside was bathed in the golden hues of late spring. The vineyards, which had long been the pride of the nation, were flourishing, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, something sinister was at work. In the small village of Roquemore, nestled along the Rhone River, a local wine grower named Borty was busy tending to his vines. Borty was no stranger to the rhythms of the vineyard. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. But this year, something was different. Despite the seemingly healthy appearance of his new American grapevines, which he had planted as an experiment, Borty couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It began subtly at first, just a few leaves on the neighboring vines turning an unseasonal yellow. Borty dismissed it as a minor issue, perhaps due to a late frost or a dry spell. But then the yellowing spread. creeping from vine to vine like a slowly moving curse. By midsummer, entire fields were affected. Leaves withered, turned red, and dropped to the ground. Borti, now deeply alarmed, knew he wasn't alone. His neighbors, too, were facing the same inexplicable blight. Word spread quickly through the village. Something was killing the vines, and no one knew what it was. Panic set in. The vineyard owners, who had devoted their lives to the cultivation of grapes, watched helplessly as their livelihoods crumbled before their eyes. Rumors flew. Was it a curse? A punishment from God? Superstition mingled with fear as the wine growers searched desperately for answers. Years passed and the plague spread like wildfire across France. By 1870, 40% of the nation's vineyards were devastated. The once thriving wine industry, which had been the backbone of the French economy, was now on the brink of collapse. Entire families were ruined, farms were abandoned, and the great chateaux of Bordeaux and Burgundy faced financial ruin. For the first time in history, France, proud and mighty France, began importing more wine than it exported. The entire nation was in crisis. Desperate for a solution, the French government convened a committee of scientists in 1868, led by Jules-Émile Planchon, a respected professor of botany. Planchon was a methodical man with a keen eye for detail and an unshakable belief in the power of science. He approached the mystery like a detective, examining the evidence with a meticulous hand. Planchon's team began by digging up the diseased vines, searching for clues. But to their frustration, they found nothing. No visible signs of insects or fungus, no clear cause for the devastation. The mystery deepened. The plague had no obvious source, but the vineyards continued to die. Then on a whim, Planchon decided to examine one of the healthy vines growing nearby. As he carefully unearthed the roots, he noticed something peculiar. Tiny yellow spots clustered around the base of the plant. He took out his magnifying glass and peered closer. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The spots were not just discolorations. They were clumps of tiny insects, almost too small to be seen with the naked eye. Planchon had found his culprit, an aphid, feeding on the roots of the vines. But there was still a mystery to solve. Where had these aphids come from? Why had they suddenly appeared? It would take another year before that question would be answered. As Planchon dug deeper into the mystery, he discovered that the aphids were not native to France. They had come from across the ocean, hitching a ride on the very American vines that Borti and others had imported. These aphids were phylloxera, a pest that had long plagued American vineyards but had little impact due to the natural resistance of American grapevines. But in France, where the vines had no such defenses, the phylloxera aphids had found a paradise, free to multiply and wreak havoc. Planchon's discovery was groundbreaking, but it was only the beginning of the story. Back in the United States, in the rolling hills of Missouri, a young entomologist named Charles Riley read about the blight devastating European vineyards. The description of the aphids sounded awfully familiar to Riley, who had studied similar pests in American vineyards. Riley reached out to Planchon and they hatched a plan. If American vines were resistant to phylloxera, perhaps they could save the European vineyards. Riley began sourcing rootstock from around Missouri, carefully selecting the most resilient vines. These rootstocks were shipped to France, where they were grafted onto the delicate European vines. But the first attempts at grafting were a disaster. The French struggled to adapt to the new techniques, and the American vines had difficulty rooting in the French soil. The initial effort was abandoned, and the plague continued to spread, reaching Spain, Portugal, Germany, and Italy by the late 1870s. In another decade, more than 2 million acres of French vineyards had been destroyed. It seemed that nothing could stop the phylloxera. That's when T.V. Munson, a horticulturist from Denison, Texas, enters the scene. Munson was no ordinary scientist. He was a man with a deep passion for grapes, driven by a desire to improve the resilience of American vineyards. His work was guided by the principles of Darwinian selection, and he believed that through careful hybridization, he could create a new generation of grapevines that would withstand any threat. Denison, with its unique combination of climates and soil types, was the perfect laboratory for Munson's experiments. He painstakingly cataloged the wild grape varieties growing in the area and began crossing them with European vines, searching for the perfect hybrid. His work attracted the attention of French scientists who were desperate for a solution to the phylloxera crisis. In 1887, Pierre Viala, a French envoy, traveled to Denison to meet with Munson. The two men, along with representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, embarked on a journey across Texas, searching for the ideal rootstock that could be grafted onto European vines. Many parts of Texas share the same limestone, chalk, and alkali soil as France. Would our rootstock have better success than the Missouri vines? Munson also shared his hybridization techniques with Viala, hoping that together they could create a vine that was both resistant to phylloxera and capable of producing the high-quality fruit that France was famous for. The stakes were incredibly high. The future of the global wine industry depended on their success. After years of trial and error, their efforts finally began to bear fruit. The new hybrids, grafted onto Texas rootstock, began to take hold in the French soil. While it took decades of careful breeding and cultivation, the phylloxera plague was eventually brought under control, thanks to the work of Munson and his French colleagues. Texas had saved the European wine industry. Munson's contributions did not go unnoticed. In 1888, he was awarded the French Legion of Honor, one of the highest accolades given by the French government. It was a fitting tribute to a man whose work had saved the European wine industry from certain doom. And so the story of the phylloxera plague, once a tale of despair and devastation, became one of triumph and renewal. The vineyards of France, Spain, Italy, and beyond were saved, thanks in large part to the efforts of a few dedicated scientists and the resilient grapevines of Texas. So fast forward now through Prohibition. Valverde Winery kept operating during Prohibition and after, but there were no other wineries that would open in the state for the next 40 years. Prohibition, for all intents and purposes, killed the Texas wine industry. There were a few reasons for this. The 21st Amendment that ended Prohibition gave states absolute control over the sales and distribution of alcohol within their borders. So many states continued Prohibition at the state level for many years after the 21st Amendment. Other states, wanting to encourage their own small but growing wine industries, needed to protect them. And many passed anti-competitive laws prohibiting the import of wine from other states. Texas put the decision at the county level, and many counties kept alcohol bans in place for decades. At its peak, 199 of 254 Texas counties remained dry, many of these in the state's prime agricultural areas conducive to grape growing. For all of these reasons, the next successful winery in Texas wouldn't appear until 1976. But that doesn't mean there weren't grapes grown in Texas. In the 1940s, a Texas Technological College horticulturalist named W.W. Yoakum planted small batches of grapes around campus. But construction expansion around the college removed many of these plantings almost as soon as they were planted, and there wasn't much actual research done on them. They were decorative at best. In the early 1950s, several South Texas farmers formed the Lower Rio Grande Valley Grape Growers Association, growing the popular Thompson seedless table grape varietal. These weren't for wine, these were just to eat. But frost, root rot, and Pierce's disease would wipe out these crops in less than a decade. This failure led to a near total absence of Texas grape research for years. By 1960, only one small batch of Yoakum's grapes remained on Texas Tech's campus. But Regents greenlit their removal so construction could proceed on the new Texas Tech Museum. Another horticulture professor, Robert Reed, dug up a few of the vines and transferred them to his backyard as a landscaping novelty. He wanted an ornamental shade canopy over his patio. This act, taken more on a whim than as a major research endeavor, would nevertheless plant the seed for the entire Texas wine industry as we know it today. To Reed's surprise, his backyard plantings flourished and produced fruit a few years later. Now, Reed befriended Texas Tech chemistry professor Clinton Doc McPherson, and McPherson, along with his wife Clara, began taking the grapes home where they would make and jar jelly from the grapes so they wouldn't go to waste. Reed and McPherson joked that they should open a roadside jelly stand during the summers to subsidize their paltry income as professors. By the 1960s, the chemist in McPherson couldn't resist trying his hand at a little experimental wine. They self-reported their tiny production to the ATF, as the law required at the time, And the ATF promptly turned the pair into the state TABC, who fined them for not obtaining the $10 license to make homemade wine and neglecting to pay the 17-cent per gallon tax on their production. McPherson obtained the proper permit from the TABC and soon expanded his efforts to the classroom. Finding his students yawning and eyes glazing over at textbooks and formula memorization, he grabbed their attention by teaching them how to produce wine in 5-gallon jugs. In early 1968, with plans to soon elevate Texas Tech from a college to a university, the administration wanted to expand the nascent university's research efforts. The president told all professors that they needed a research project. So Reed and McPherson put together a proposal for a small research winery in the basement of the new chemistry building. It was approved, along with $1,500 in funding. And after navigating red tape from the EPA, FDA, IRS, and TABC, Lubbock had itself a winery. Now, a winery needs grapes. So the pair soon purchased, out of their own pockets, 15 acres of land in Lubbock's southeast quadrant. They sourced hundreds of different grape varietals from around the country, most just 5 to 10 vines at a time, and then planted and carefully inspected them to see which ones would grow in their West Texas plot, which they named Sagamore Vineyard due to the conspicuous sagging of their trellis supports under the weight of so many grapes. Not to be left out, Texas A&M wanted to make their foray into grapes as well, and in 1968, they partnered with the Abernathy Chamber of Commerce to develop a research vineyard north of Lubbock. The chamber was interested in diversifying their economic base away from just cotton. The endeavor suffered from theft and vandalism, as well as fierce opposition from the local church community, reportedly threatening one farmer with excommunication if he continued to assist with the effort. In 1974, the Abernathy Chamber pulled funding from the project. But both of these efforts would make the same discovery: that Texas High Plains grapes didn't suffer from the same maladies as crops attempted elsewhere in the state. They didn't find root rot, Pierce's disease, phylloxera, or nematodes. The climate was also very favorable, mimicking the great grape growing regions in Spain and France. Warm days, cool nights, low humidity. This meant that it should be possible in the Lubbock area to grow the famous European varietals that had failed elsewhere in the state, names that people knew. In 1973, seeing the commercial potential of their research, Reed and McPherson planned a field day for area farmers and anyone else interested in learning about their experiment and its potential to transform agriculture on the South Plains. They had a great turnout for the event, but few of the cotton farmers showed much interest. By far, the most excitement was shown by the professionals in attendance, doctors, lawyers, and bankers, who had much more exposure to the exploding wine culture emanating from California at that time. But there were a few visionary farmers in the group, 27 to be exact, hailing from exotic locales like Morton, Whiteface, Sundown, Levelland, and Littlefield. These pioneers planted the first commercial grapes on the South Plains and soon formed a trade association for grape growers. An industry was born. No one had the funds on their own to build a commercial winery, though, so the plan was to form a co-op, a concept very familiar to these farmers who were used to co-op cotton gins and even electric providers. Reed helped the farmers grow the new crop, suggesting which grapes to grow and teaching them the techniques to do it. He suggested French-American hybrids that they knew were resistant to most common diseases. Though their preliminary research showed that the Vitis vinifera would grow in West Texas, they weren't confident enough to stake the entire industry on it. They needed to succeed, and if one of the plagues did suddenly appear and wipe out a crop, it could kill the industry before it even got going. So Reed told the farmers they should plant Baco Noir, Saval Blanc, and Verdelais grapes. Meanwhile, back on campus, the little winery chugged along, an afterthought among the many research projects at Texas Tech, until in 1975, Lady Bird Johnson visited Lubbock. The former First Lady toured the winery and experimental vineyards and told the Avalanche Journal that she, quote, took special notice of the landscape and agriculture of West Texas, especially the sunflowers and vineyards, end quote. Her endorsement and attention to the program would make waves around the state, catching the attention of legislators. And Amarillo State Senator Max Sherman would push through a new line item in the budget to encourage the development of the Texas grape industry, a $25,000 yearly grant split between Texas Tech and the University of Texas, because of course it was, starting in 1976. So, surely, with this influx of funding and positive attention brought to Texas Tech, Reed and McPherson were the kings of the campus, right? Well, no. Texas Tech gladly accepted the funding, but they placed another professor, Dr. Roy Mitchell, and not Doc McPherson, in charge of the wine research lab. Why? Well, Reed and McPherson had a pretty major conflict of interest. Not only were they running their own private grape farm off campus, not only were they mentoring commercial farmers and advising the Texas Grape Growers Association, but they were now actively working to permit a private commercial winery. I mentioned that it takes 2 to 3 years from planting before grapevines will produce fruit. So it was going to be a tricky proposition for the farmers who had to invest in fields for multiple years with no crops to harvest, to then also fund a winery that needed to be built and ready when those grapes did finally appear. Reed and McPherson had wowed the local professional class in their field day. And from that group, they found investors, mainly lawyers, willing to gamble $180,000 on a full scale winery. So the paperwork was filed, and after permitting delays with the state, it seemed no one at the TABC knew how to even permit a winery. They finally got approval in 1976, and the Llano Estacado Winery was born, the first commercial winery in the state in 40 years, named after an entry in Spanish explorer Coronado's diary calling the area the Llano Estacado. The original building was nothing like the ornate wineries of today. They started small. It was just a 3,500 square foot cinder block building with a 12,000 gallon capacity. They had no full-time employees. Reed, McPherson, and their investors worked the equipment themselves, crushing and bottling on nights and weekends. Once their process was perfected, though, they could bottle up to 225 cases per day. So finally, with everything they needed to build a commercial wine operation, they still faced a major hurdle. Due to state law, they weren't allowed to sell wine on site, and distributors weren't jumping at the opportunity to partner with a new winery with tiny production. So who were they going to sell the wine to? Luckily, they had West Texas liquor baron Pinky Roden in their court. He's featured in 2 of our previous episodes. And after some lobbying work at the state level, the legislature passed a new law allowing wineries to sell their product on site direct to consumers, as well as allowing free tastings. These new laws would be a big boost for the industry, and slowly more wineries started popping up around the state. There were 5 by 1980. Llano eventually hired Walter Hyman, former president of Seagram's, who had a much better understanding of the global industry than a bunch of West Texas professors and lawyers. Doc McPherson's son, Kim, who had been in California learning the wine business, took over as the head winemaker. In 1980, producing 30,000 cases per year, Llano landed a distribution deal, another first for the state.
Riding through the dusty plains, sunsets glow as my range, silent town, showdown day, singing with my old guitar. I got more money than I know what to do with. Yes, more money than I know what to do with.
Now that Reed, McPherson, and Texas Tech had proven it could be done, and with the grant money from the legislature that had fallen into their lap, the University of Texas wanted in on the action too. You see, they were sitting on 2 million acres of West Texas land, a gift from the state's early leaders to help fund the university. Early on, this land wasn't valuable for much of anything except grazing, and the majority of the revenue generated was from cattle grazing leases. That would all change in the 1920s when oil was discovered on university lands, generating billions in mineral rights payments that continue to this day. But in the 1970s, UT wanted to see if they could squeeze any more money out of West Texas and charged their surface interest manager with finding new revenue streams. He investigated several options like apple and nut orchards, or even a vineyard. One morning in 1974, Dr. Reed arrived at their Sagamore Vineyard in Lubbock to find an uninvited guest. He said, quote, "We went out to the vineyard one morning and there was this University of Texas truck parked in our vineyard and this guy walking up and down the grape rows. He said he was from the University of Texas and they were studying the feasibility of growing grapes down there and wanted to see how we doing up here. And that was our association with the University of Texas," end quote. UT decided in 1975 to plant a 12-acre experimental grape vineyard on university lands near Van Horn. In 1980, UT Regents would tour the operation and sample wines. They were good. So Regents approved a new 1,000-acre vineyard to be developed near Fort Stockton. They partnered with Richardson Gill, a UT grad and businessman, and Domaine Cordier, a French winery, to oversee the planting of the vines and construction of the massive, state-of-the-art St. Genevieve winery. In true UT fashion, no expense was spared. Even the floor tiles were imported from France. By the time it was finished, UT had invested $7 million in the project. Vintners were relocated from the Bordeaux region of France to Fort Stockton to operate the facility, and UT took a step back operationally. The private interest would run the winery, and UT would sit back and collect a royalty from every bottle sold. St. Genevieve would grow to become the largest winery in Texas, at its peak producing over 1.3 million gallons per year, more than half of Texas's total wine production. And even with 1,000 acres of grapes, its production would exceed its local growing ability, and they eventually turned to imported juice from Australia and France. Now, much of that volume wasn't sold under the St. Genevieve label. The winery produced wines under a number of names. The largest Texas grocery and package store chains had their own exclusive labels, and the winery even produced white label house wines for restaurants around the country. But even with all that volume, the winery would struggle. A foreclosure in 1985 would almost do them in, but following a restructuring, they were allowed to continue operating. The winery was sold to Mesa Vineyards in 2005, but a late 2014 freeze would wipe out their entire grape harvest that year. Then COVID happened. While alcohol sales boomed during the lockdown, St. Genevieve lost so much sales due to restaurant closures that they weren't able to recover. The winery went under in 2022, and the massive vineyard now sits untended to slowly be reclaimed by the desert sands. Back at the Llano Estacado winery, business was booming. A shift away from the U.S.-French hybrid grapes and into popular European Vitis vinifera varietals like Chardonnay, Merlot, and Cabernet had helped to boost sales. The hybrid grape wines were high quality, but the average retail consumer had never heard of Baco Noir, and distributors wanted wines with recognizable names on the bottle. The farmers had to be dragged kicking and screaming. They had, of course, committed substantial investments in the hybrid varietals that Dr. Reed had recommended. Lawsuits were filed. Some even threatened winery operators with physical violence. But eventually a compromise was reached. Llano would still buy the hybrid grapes at the $100 to $200 a ton price they had always paid. But if you brought them European grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, they would pay $500 to $600 a ton. The free market eventually won the day. Llano would begin racking up awards, including a rare double gold medal at San Francisco for their 1984 Chardonnay, beating out 2,000 other wines from Sonoma and Napa Valley. Today, they are the largest winery in Texas, producing a staggering 160,000 cases per year. The tide began to turn in the late 20th century as more and more Texas farmers and entrepreneurs recognized the potential of viticulture. In 1981, there were only 7 wineries in the state, but by 1996, that number had grown to 37. The industry was finally on the rise, but progress was still hampered by outdated laws and regulations. One of the biggest hurdles was the restriction on interstate wine sales. Protectionist state laws banning imports from out of state made it difficult for Texas wineries to expand their markets beyond the state's borders. It wasn't until 2005 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that these restrictions violated the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Texas wineries could now fully tap into the national market. But even with this victory, Texas wineries continued to face challenges at home. The state's complex web of dry counties and restrictive local laws made it difficult for many wineries to operate. This changed in 2007 when the Texas legislature passed a landmark law allowing wineries in dry counties to freely sell their products on site as long as the wine was bottled in Texas and contained at least 75% Texas grapes. This law also allowed wineries to operate tasting rooms, a crucial element in attracting and engaging customers. With these regulatory hurdles finally beginning to fall, the Texas wine industry entered a period of explosive growth. Today, Texas boasts 8 federally designated American viticulture areas, AVAs, each representing a geographically limited grape growing area with distinctive climate conditions. The 8 Texas AVAs are Texas Hill Country, one of the largest and most well-known AVAs, located in central Texas, known for its rolling hills and diverse microclimates. Bell Mountain, a tiny 5-square-mile AVA north of Fredericksburg, notable for its unique terroir and high-quality wines. Fredericksburg in the Texas Hill Country, a microclimate region within but separate from the larger Hill Country AVA, offering its own distinctive characteristics. Texoma, an AVA running along the Red River, which forms the boundary between Texas and Oklahoma, known for its warm climate and fertile soil. And then we get to the 4 West Texas AVAs. Mesilla Valley, located north and west of El Paso, this AVA straddles the Texas-New Mexico border and benefits from a hot, arid climate perfect for certain grape varietals. Texas Davis Mountains, known for its high elevation and cooler temperatures, this AVA is one of the most unique wine-growing regions in Texas. Escondido Valley, located in Pecos County near Fort Stockton, this AVA is characterized by its desert-like conditions, which produce robust and intense wines. And finally, Texas High Plains, the crown jewel of Texas viticulture. At 8 million acres, it's the 3rd largest AVA in the country, encompassing all or part of 24 counties, from the Caprock escarpment to the New Mexico border. The Texas High Plains AVA produces 85% of Texas grapes, and its unique combination of warm days, cool nights, and low humidity has made it the backbone of the Texas wine industry. While the Hill Country, with its proximity to the state's major population centers, has become a hub for wine tourism, it's the Texas High Plains that produce the majority of the grapes used in Texas wines. This duality between the tourist-friendly Hill Country and the production-heavy High Plains has become a defining feature of the Texas wine industry. If you go down and tour some of the vineyards in Fredericksburg, a lot of them will have a few acres of grapes planted there, but the wine you're drinking, those grapes don't come from those vineyards. They're coming from West Texas. As more Texas farmers turn to grapes as a viable crop, the state's agriculture landscape is undergoing a significant transformation. Grapes offer several advantages over traditional crops like cotton, particularly in the Texas High Plains, where farmers are dependent on the rapidly shrinking Ogallala aquifer. Grapes require less than half the water needed for cotton, and they can yield comparable profits from a much smaller footprint. However, this shift has sparked a fierce debate in rural communities across Texas, particularly in the High Plains. The close proximity of vast cotton fields and other row crops to meticulously tended vineyards has created a unique conflict, one that's not seen in other wine-growing regions. It's centered around 2 herbicides, dicamba and 2,4-D. Cotton farmers rely on these chemicals to control weeds, particularly with the development of genetically engineered herbicide-resistant cotton varieties. The problem is that grapevines are incredibly sensitive to these herbicides. Even a small amount of herbicide drift can wreak havoc on a vineyard, in some cases causing entire crops to fail. Grape growers argue that their livelihoods are at risk, while cotton farmers contend that these herbicides are crucial for their crop management and economic viability. Meanwhile, the chemical companies maintain that their products are safe and any issues with drift are due to improper application by the farmers. Everyone's pointing fingers. The Texas Department of Agriculture is caught in the middle with the challenging task of enforcing herbicide regulations and balancing the interests of both industries. In 2021, 57 Texas High Plains grape growers representing 3,000 acres of vines, along with 4 grape processors, filed a $570 million lawsuit against Bayer Crop Science, Monsanto, and BASF, alleging negligence in the design, development, and manufacture of their dicamba-resistant cotton cropping systems. One of the plaintiffs, a Terry County grower, claimed that his annual grape production had decreased from 800 tons to under 100 tons after his neighbors implemented the dicamba-resistant cottonseed. The lawsuit continues to work its way through the court system. But one thing that's certain is that the EPA and the Texas Department of Agriculture will have to figure out a way to navigate a complex and contentious issue that could shape the future of Texas agriculture. Today, Texas is home to over 400 wineries, with more acres of vineyards being planted every year. The state's wine industry has become a significant economic force, generating $20 billion annually and supporting over 140,000 full-time jobs. 2 million tourists visit Texas wineries, drawn by the state's diverse and award-winning wines. There are at least a dozen wineries within 30 minutes of Lubbock, including award winners English Newsom, Adelpho Cellars, Ready Vineyards, La Diosa Cellars, Prairie Chick Winery, and Sandfighter Wines. Kim McPherson would form his own winery, McPherson Cellars, in an old Coca-Cola bottling plant in downtown Lubbock. Then, of course, there's Llano Estacado. A thriving tourism scene is developing and continues to grow. Wine industry leaders will tell you that West Texas is now growing better quality Vitis vinifera than can even be produced in these grapes' native homes in France, Italy, and Spain. And blind taste tests have backed this up as well, with a growing slate of awards earned by wines made from West Texas grapes. Texas Tech's contributions to the industry continue to be felt as well, with the university offering an undergraduate degree in viticulture and winemaking, as well as professional certificate programs. The university maintains wine labs and teaching vineyards in both Lubbock and Fredericksburg, ensuring that the next generation of Texas winemakers are equipped with the knowledge and skills needed to continue the state's legacy. The Texas wine industry has come a long way from its humble beginnings in the 1970s. What began as a professor's casual planting of shade vines has evolved into a thriving industry that is now poised to solidify its place as a significant player on the global wine stage. With more awards being earned at prestigious competitions and more wineries popping up across the state, Texas is proving that it can produce world-class wines that rival those from traditional wine regions. The pioneering spirit that has long defined Texas is now writing a new chapter in the state's agricultural history, one vine at a time. You've been listening to the West Texas Podcast. I'm Jody Slaughter. You can find this and all episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Visit our website at wtxpodcast.com for companion articles, show notes, and photos for each episode. To get a hold of me with questions, comments, or show ideas, you can email me at lubbockist@gmail.com or on Twitter @lubbockist. This episode was written, produced, engineered, and edited by me, Jody Slaughter. All music in this episode was created by my AI band, Gentry Ford and the Homeless Lobos. You can find more from them on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music. Special thanks to Catherine Crane and Dr. Neil Crane for their book, The History of Texas Wine, as well as Eric D. Sanchez for his 1996 master's thesis, Forked Tendrils, Llano Estacado Winery and the Rise of the Modern Texas Wine Industry. Much of the podcast came from these two sources. As always, thanks for listening, and so long from West Texas.
About where West Texas begins. Some think it's Fort Worth, somewhere near the cattle pens. Some think it's I-35 packed with Fords and Chevrolets. Others think it's where the oak trees start to fade to sand and clay. Straight once and for all. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. Them Pecos Valley purists think they've got the winning hand, but they ain't gonna paint me as some Eastern Yankee man. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. Midland, West Texas. Lubbock, West Texas. Kerrville, West Texas. All West Texas. Austin, West Texas. Houston, West Texas. Tyler, West Texas. All West Texas. Seattle, West Texas. Springfield, West Texas. Chicago, West Texas. All West Texas. Manhattan, West Texas. Miami, West Texas. Toronto, West Texas. All West Texas.